Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Stay at Home. I'm Oscar Sankara, the editor and publisher of Jacobin, and I'm joined today by a left-wing thinker, René Rojas, who's a assistant professor at SUNY Binghamton and a editorial board member of Catalyst. And you might know René from his previous talk on this channel, or you might know him from the couple pieces that he did for Catalyst. The one from 2 summers ago was the Latin American left's shifting tides. And there's one just in the latest edition of Catalyst, which got released this week, called The End of Progressive Neoliberalism. The first piece talks about the pink tide. The most recent piece focuses on Brazil, Mexico, and Chile. And René has roots in Chile, and this is a topic that I think he'll really excel at talking about, which is not the recent post-democratic regime in Chile, but what happened before, what brought to an end several decades of democratic rule in Chile. I think they had Republican rule for, 40, 50 years almost before September 11th, 1973, in the coup against Salvador Allende, socialist government. So a lot of these talks often focus hyper focus on the United States' role in the overthrow of Allende. Rightly so, focus on a long campaign of destabilization. The U.S. played a role even preventing him from coming to power in the 1960s, not just to say nothing of his years in power in the early 1970s. But what I want René to do, and what we'll try to focus on, is a discussion that covers a bit about the context in which Allende came to power, and that talks about what the government managed to achieve, especially in its first year and a half in office before the crisis really came to a head. Then I want to get into depth about really what were the causes of the crisis. What do the different actors want? The Christian Democrats in Chile were attempting kind of a soft constitutional coup that got out of control. What exactly happened? So I want to get at some of the questions that don't often get talked about. So obviously it's September 11th today, and September 11th, 1973 is the hook to get you interested in this topic and this talk. But hopefully we'll broaden out the discussion a little bit. So as usual, before I ask René the first question, just press like, press subscribe, share the feed, tell the other people you're watching it, and please do leave your questions for René, because I'll give some of mine to kick us off, but we'll do a bunch of other questions as well. But René, first of all, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here.
So actually, I'm getting some feedback. So you should lower. Do you have speakers on? You should lower your speakers a little bit, or your computer audio or something. I don't know. Maybe just me. A little bit of feedback. I won't be talking that much, so it won't matter too much. But
that's better.
So to start with, can you talk about Allende's early years? So he was involved in the Popular Front government that Chile had in the 1930s. He served as a health minister. Can you talk about his general ideological outlook, and also what the political milieu was in Chile at the time? Because it seemed broadly, I'm no expert in the period or the country, but it seems like a left of center moment in milieu. You have a radical party that's broadly anti-clerical. You have real reforms being made. Even up until the Allende government coming to power, you have land reform and other things underway. So can you describe both Allende's role and the general political milieu in the years leading up to socialist victory?
Yeah, and if I may, let me go back a bit further and say something more general about Allende himself. I think it's important to view Allende as not just this kind of heroic president who gave his life, for socialism in Chile. And he was that, and he did give his life. He did sacrifice his life. There's a way in which Allende plays a larger role in all of modern, or most of 20th century Chilean history. I mean, Allende rises as a politician, right, with the rise of the workers' movement in Chile and with the rise of socialism in Chile. And in many ways, Allende, I don't necessarily subscribe to, great a view of history, right, that's centered around great leaders and great men and great individuals. But Allende was kind of that in Chile. I mean, he is the helmsman, as it were, of the, these rising popular movements, central among them the labor movement and the movement for socialism in Chile. And so he's marshaling, right, these forces. He's marshaling these movements through very complex terrain that shifts throughout his life and his political career. And in fact, his political career precedes the rise of the Popular Front. Allende was one of the founders of the Socialist Party in Chile in the early 30s. Allende, along with others, founded the party as a socialist, as a Marxist party, but that was supposed to be an alternative to the Communist Party, that was supposed to offer certain views, organizing methods and models and certain strategies that were more independent of the party, of the Communist Party, and according to them, that corresponded to Chilean conditions and Chilean circumstances in ways that the CP, which was heavily Moscow oriented, sometimes tended to overlook and would just go along with what Moscow would order from abroad. So that was the early 30s. In around that time, actually, there's this short moment where the republic that you named, that was kind of officially founded in 1925, breaks down. This is in the middle of the Depression, and there's this short-lived socialist republic, and that's really where he cut his teeth. He was centrally involved in that, again, very short-lived attempt to build a socialist republic in the early 30s. But as you mentioned, right, it becomes more prominent later on that decade and through the 40s during the Popular Front era, right, where a coalition government led by the radicals at the time were like the modernizing, as you said, anti-clerical party that was trying to, if not take power totally away from the landed elite, at least foster some kind of a power sharing arrangement where middle layers had more of a say in directing the development of the country. That was the Radical Party. But, in typical Popular Front fashion, it was a wide-ranging center-left coalition that included both Allende's Socialist Party and the Communist Party. The Communist Party at the time, and up until the coup, really, was the party that had the deepest roots in Chilean labor and Chile's kind of manufacturing industrial class and in the mining sector in the northern parts of the country as well. So that was Allende's kind of first very important role in Chilean politics. He served as you mentioned, as health minister in the first of those governments, I think. But by the late 40s, the Popular Front coalition breaks down. And part of it is because of this tension, this internal tension, and the presence of the Communist Party that was the strongest left party, as I mentioned, right? And they get kicked out. And then between the late 40s and early 50s, Chile enters a transition moment. And once again, Allende plays a central role. And this often gets overlooked, and I think it deserves more attention because there's really a before and an after early 1952. Allende first runs for president in 52. He only gets like 4.5% of the vote. But what's happening, again, this is the post-Popular Front era. What's happening is that for the first time, Chile's working class and popular sectors are vying for power on their own, right? And so Allende's first run in 52 and then later on in 58, of course, 64 until he finally wins elections, right, is organized around a new coalition. But this time, it's not a coalition that collaborates with and shares responsibilities with the modernizing bourgeoisie. It's an independent working class coalition that, first gets named the FRAP, the Front, the Front for Popular Action, And then finally, when he wins power in 70, it's called the Popular Unity Government, and the mainstays, kind of the pillars of the coalition, are the Socialist and the Communist Party, particularly the Communists, who are the strongest party in the coalition. So interestingly, Allende kind of traverses this whole period, and he's at the forefront and the leadership of these shifts that the labor movement and the movement for socialism is kind of navigating and making these decisions along the way.
So I'm wondering whether you could also, just briefly discuss Chile's system. It's not a parliamentary system. It's a presidential system with a unicameral Congress.
No.
Or
so in 1925, right, where this new republic is established, right, it's a mixed system. It's a bicameral system, right? But that does give the presidency a bit more power. I mean, that was one of the reasons it was founded in the earliest 20th century, to kind of challenge the power of elites, particularly landed elites, who really had a hold on government through Parliament, in particular through the higher chamber, through Senate, through the Senate. Now, you said earlier, and I didn't touch on this, right, that it seemed that throughout, like for instance in the Popular Front years, overall, Allende and the movement was operating in a progressive or kind of center-left milieu. I wouldn't entirely agree with that. It is true that there are these moments, these reformist moments, and I don't mean to downplay the significance of those reforms. We can get into it later, but particularly his predecessor, who was a Christian Democrat in 1964, from 64 to 70, right, is his presidency, Eduardo Frei. He implements some really, really substantial and pretty deep reforms. They just don't go far enough. Having said that, Chile's, the whole trajectory of Chilean political history, I don't think can be established, can be characterized the way you did. First of all, even though it's an official republic, right, it's not a full democracy. There's not really universal suffrage. And besides the fact that there were entire sectors who were excluded from meaningful democratic participation, and the peasantry is a key one, right? Chile remains not predominantly, but still largely a rural society, right? But then there are also these moments, like the latter part of the Popular Front, where the left is proscribed, and the Communist Party in particular is proscribed and heavily repressed, right? So that's kind of what characterizes the political scenario. So when Allende, is vying for power in the 50s, and particularly the 60s, then takes power, one way to understand the mission and the objectives of the Popular Unity government is to fully democratize Chile, right? To extend meaningful rights for participation and decision making, across the board, and also, of course, to democratize the economy and the socioeconomic terms as well. Now, what's interesting about this is seen from this perspective, right, is that Allende, comes to power, and one of his tasks, right, one of the aims is to complete democratization of Chilean society, right? A task that, elites and bourgeois elites had failed to accomplish, right? And that, along with the democratization of society that I just discussed, the other thing that he's tasked with, and his government is tasked with doing, is further developing the country in economic terms, in terms of growth, because it was a very backward economy at the time, right? So he's got to accomplish those two things. But of course, because this had not been accomplished under quote unquote regular bourgeois rule, right? The path he chooses to take to accomplish this, right, is the radical path, is the socialist path. And that's what we know as Chile's road to socialism.
So the road to socialism, too, invokes the dominant strategies of a lot of CPs at the time. around the world, from later on Portugal to in the 80s, 70s and 80s during this transition, the plans of the Spanish CP or the British CP or any of these others kind of had the respective road to socialism, which was, based on this conception that you would finish the democratic revolution, which the bourgeoisie was unable or unwilling really to do. Then also in the case of Chile, you would try to fight dependency on the United States. You would pursue some sort of industrialization program. And in this respect, kind of jumping ahead to what the government was trying to do when it's in power, the nationalization of the commanding heights and other measures should be primarily seen not as the first, I guess there are first steps in a sense, but not as attempts to bring about a rapid socialization of the economy for ideological reasons, but an attempt to pursue this sort of industrial policy. Is that right?
Yeah, I think both things are going on. But one way to think of it is that the first task, in one way, is a precondition for the second task. I mean, to really move towards socialism in Chile, you had to modernize the economy, industrialize the economy, raise productivity rates. And a big part of that, for instance, was to destroy what remained of the landlord class's power, which would always, had always served as a brake, this big obstacle to any modernizing effort of Chile's society and economy, right?
So land reform.
The thing is, he had to do it simultaneously. He had to do both of those things simultaneously.
So land reform had started in some form a little bit earlier under the Christian Democrats, right? But it was a kind of a halting, limited land reform.
Depends how you look at it. I actually think that it was quite radical when placed in the context of what it was trying to achieve. So what happened in the early 60s, right? This, again, post-Popular Front era, right? Is that Chile enters this period of stagnation. In spite of the attempts to industrialize the country, beginning in the late 30s and throughout the 40s and 50s, right? Industrialization just had not gone far enough, right? And one of the reasons is because of what I mentioned earlier, what you're alluding to now, the fact that the landlord class still had enormous amounts of power, and its power was founded in its control of land. Chile had one of the most unequal land distributions in the world at the time, and not only an unequal land distribution, very backward in social and productivity terms, really backward agrarian system. And so when Frei, the Christian Democratic, Allende's Christian Democratic predecessor, is elected in 1964, he understands that he really has to do something to get Chile out of this stagnation, to get Chile's productive forces, if you want to use that language, right, accelerating, right? Because you have not just an economic problem, you have a social problem at your hands, and mass movements are building and building and applying more and more pressure. And so one of the main policies that Frei pursues in order to accomplish this is agrarian reform, is land redistribution, to get land out of the landed elites' hands and get it producing more efficiently, right, in smaller, more technified units. He was into like cooperatives, whatever. And so he distributes, I think, something like over 1,000 of these large plantations. He takes over and redistributes, these plantations. So it accomplished quite a bit, but as usual, and this is kind of the story of what Allende is facing, it just wasn't enough. So when Allende comes to power, one of his aims is to accelerate and deepen the land reform process. But I don't think we should totally we shouldn't understate
right
what Frei was trying to do and what he actually accomplished. And I should add, in the 1970 elections, right, where the Christian Democrats, are running again, obviously, the candidate they choose, this guy didn't have a very Chilean name, Volodymyr Tomic, a lot of kind of Serbo-Croatian names in Chile, but Tomic actually presents a really, in today's world would be a really radical reform program, right? That also included the deepening of land reform, and included further nationalizations of industry, further welfare reforms in terms of welfare provision and protections.
So I don't want to take us too far afield, because I actually want to get to the Allende government in particular, but just for a little bit more backdrop. So in '58, the right of center forces, or I guess just broadly, the center and the right forces are divided, and Allende almost wins the election.
Yeah.
So then, and by the way, this is just my kind of glib understanding, so correct me wherever I'm wrong. In
no,
64,
this is a key thing that's going on. What's happening among elites at the time?
Right. And in '64, there's a consolidation of the elite behind Frey, and obviously, especially in the U.S., a lot of people in the U.S. left know the CIA and other forces are supporting his campaign and the anti-Allende campaign in various ways, like particularly monetary support for the campaign and launching their own kind of propaganda efforts, trying to paint Allende as a communist or some sort of person with dictatorial aspirations. But then in '70,
that would take away and eat your babies. Is that kind of rhetoric?
Right. But then in 1970, the center and the right forces once again split, because you have the Christian Democrats running their own campaign, which gets around like 30% of the vote. Then just below Allende, if Allende was like 36, like 35, is the right of center candidate. So I guess that it seems like the lessons of the 1958 campaign are basically forgotten, or at the very least, they couldn't consolidate under a candidate like they were able to in '64.
Yeah, that's right. All it's going on, and it's important, I think, to try to get a grasp on why they weren't able to. It's not that they didn't learn the lessons, but weren't able to act upon them again in 1970. So you're right. So in '58, Allende comes very close to winning, right? But the traditional right-wing candidate with ties to the old elite wins. He sneaks by, and during that presidency, which is an absolute failure in development terms, economically speaking, and also in containing rising mass movements, to make sure that Allende doesn't win, elites, both kind of the old right elites and this new modernizing center, right, which is organized around the Christian Democrats, they come together. And it's explicitly to make sure Allende does not win the elections. Frey wins by a wide margin, and he wins. We'll get into this later, as you said in the opening, but he wins, far less because of support from the U.S., but because of what you said, this lesson that they draw from 1958. Now, why weren't they able to replicate a similar strategy 6 years later? Well, it's precisely because of, I hate to use this term, but the kind of contradictions that emerge and are in full display under Frey. Because on the one hand, he needs to modernize the country to get things under control, right, and to get the country, producing in terms of industry and in agrarian terms as well, right? And he needs to contain the mass movement that's bubbling up. Now, to do both of those things, it's inevitable. He has to go against the interest of certain elites, right? And that's what really, really pisses off the traditional right-leaning elites, because they feel that they can't count on him. They can't trust on him. They can't trust him. Not only did he go after, for instance, their land, right? And not only did he try to discipline industrialists, right? He's not really successful and effective in containing the rising mass movement either.
He only emboldens them with his reforms.
Exactly.
And things like that. So he has no control of the situation. Oh, by the way, he's term limited out. Like you could only get one term as opposed to a 6-year term.
You couldn't have consecutive terms.
Okay, right.
Yeah. So that one of the ploys they try to enact to prevent Allende from actually assuming office, right, after he's elected, is to get Congress, because he didn't get a majority, he won with a plurality, and Congress had to approve, is to get Congress to run against him, name someone else president, who would then resign, and then Frei could become president, because he couldn't do it in succession.
Right. So,
but,
so,
but
so, so Allende did, though, need in 1970, when he narrowly wins the election by 1% or so, because he doesn't have an outright majority, he needs from Congress confirmation, right?
That's right.
And traditionally, during the Republican period, it would be just given to the person at the highest popular vote. This time, there was
1958.
As it happened in 58. This time, though, there's more controversy around it, and Allende has to make certain concessions even to get confirmed. Can you kind of get into that? Is that actually inconsequential? Because that's often talked about by kind of mainstream accounts of Allende's coming to power.
It's interesting. The first thing to notice is that they kind of pulled out all the stops before Allende is inaugurated, including this failed kidnapping attempt that ends up assassinating the general who would have been head of the armed forces, who was a loyalist, René Schneider. And so Allende is under pressure. He understands he won. Not only did he not obtain a majority, he wins with a very narrow plurality. It's one percentage point, a little over 1% percentage points. And so part of the deal was that Congress said, okay, we'll confirm the election results and you'll be president, but you have to, swear to abide by the Constitution. And that your reform program would stick to existing legislation, or at least would not depend on centralization of presidential powers that might be like for him ruling by decree, for instance. Right now, was that consequential? In a way, it was. But my guess is that even if he had been able to achieve confirmation without making that deal, I don't think the opposition would have behaved any differently, or would have felt that their hands were tied, as it were, because Allende hadn't made that commitment to the constitutional order.
So once he's in power, can you? So land reform is accelerated. Can you just talk about the basic reforms that are implemented in the first year? I don't know exactly when this happened in the timetable of the government, but I know there was a massive housing construction campaign. There was large increases in salaries, which at least in the first year was not accompanied by inflation. So there was a large increase in real wages for workers. So I guess maybe just talk about the first year in power and the early achievements, or any direction you want. I'm just
sure. No, absolutely. But it's good to make that distinction, right? There's a year and a half where things look really good. And then there's a remainder, a little over a year and a half, but then there's a remainder of his presidency where things kind of start to look pretty bad, and an economic crisis really intensifies. But so let's just start. I mean, his objectives, of course, are to control the commanding heights of the economy, right? Important industry, important utilities, for instance. Of course, central here is mining, right? Because copper is Chile's number one export. It's responsible for, anywhere between like 75 and 85% of hard currency, cash reserves, dollar reserves. So there's that. Oh, and banking, of course, as well. Banking was a big part of it. Another one, as we mentioned, the deepening of land reform and extending it to areas that had not been touched. And then there's, a very important kind of redistributive plank in his program, which is redistribute the country's income, right, and along with that, extend or maybe even implement for the first time serious social protections and provisions, right. and he, as you mentioned, in the first year and a half, a little more than that, he accomplishes quite a bit. Starting from the last point, the first thing is to note unemployment is cut virtually in half by 1972. So it reaches 3.5%, which is something that had been unprecedented in Chile. As you mentioned, real wages rose by about 50% compared to 1968. If you look at just manufacturing wages, they go up by, I think, a quarter, 25%, something like that. And the other thing that's happening at the time in terms of this redistributive effort is that the gap between professional salaries and the rise of professional and mid-layer salaries, right, and kind of blue-collar, unskilled wages shrinks, which was quite significant at the time. Then there's a series of social reforms, which include huge increases in spending on healthcare. You mentioned housing. There's this big effort to build housing because Chile was suffering this massive housing deficit. There's other increases in educational spending, and then all sorts of protections that are implemented as well. So, for instance, in terms of housing, there's legislation that limits the rent that could be charged to tenants to 10% of their family's incomes, things like that. Throughout this time, the Gini coefficient drops significantly. I mean, Chile went from one of the most unequal societies in the world to still an unequal one, but far more egalitarian. I think the Gini coefficient drops, from 0.56, right, to like 0.48 from 1970 to 1972, right? Just to compare this to what the center-left government has done or did since redemocratization in 1990. It took them 20 years to accomplish that level of redistribution and egalitarian outcomes that Allende did in 2 years, or the Popular Unity government did in 2 years. But, there's all those kinds of social achievements. There's a massive increase in the pace of land reform, so that something like 4,000 of these large land holdings are redistributed. And then, and this is really, really significant, there's the policy of socialization of what at the time was called bringing industry and productive assets into the social area. I think it was social property area would be the translation. And by the end of 1971, about 150 large companies had been expropriated and were operating under the social property area. A year later, September 1972, it rises to 250 large corporations which get nationalized. And basically, this amounts to almost half of all Chilean industry being under public control by 1972.
So now, when we get to the and obviously there's other achievements. There's massive efforts for rural literacy, nutrition, efforts to make sure that people in rural areas, and particularly indigenous, people have access to good schools, and there's a milk program for children, and all those other achievements, which left a real impact. Now, obviously, we could just have a very simple narrative that I think people would like, and I think it serves our purposes as socialists based in the U.S., which is to highlight and foreground the role of the U.S. destabilizing everything. So what I want you to do is try to disaggregate between three different things when explaining the crisis of the next year and a half after this very good start. So one would be macroeconomic failures, like potentially too much spending and too much wage increases too quickly. Then just the general thing that we think is a good thing, which is that workers getting emboldened, too militant, and people pushing the face of land reform too fast, and so on. For all sorts of reasons why we think that socialism within capitalism has certain limits, and you either need to go beyond the capitalist political economy, or you might risk being a situation where you go too far for capitalism but not far enough for socialism. So that broadly under the umbrella of macroeconomic problems. Second umbrella would be just domestic reaction, in terms of legitimate, put in square quotes, revolt of petty proprietors and other kind of middling strata that he might have had in his coalition at first, but maybe were alienated and drifted away. Then in the last camp, you would say, like, big Chilean capitalists and their supporters in the U.S. as far as organizing strikes and both capital strikes and actually worker strikes and things like that. So I know that's a really big question, but I'm wondering if you could just talk about the crisis, but with that in mind. Like, we're trying to decipher what kind of mix played a role, instead of just focusing on the role of Henry Kissinger.
Yeah. There's a lot to say there, and I like the way you frame it, because if we start off by talking about kind of the conditions for the rise of Allende and the popular unity, right, and how they came to power. Then we talked about the actual accomplishments of the popular unity government in the first 2 years of Allende's presidency, right? Now we're going on to talk about the problems it faces, the real challenges it faces that lead to this deep crisis, right? And it's really, really important to get this straight, because I guess the kind of next big question we will talk about is the final fall, the toppling of the Allende government, right? And to really understand what happened there, I think this antecedent set of issues is quite important. I just want to say a little more about this notion that what determined everything was the black and demonic hand of U.S. intervention. I totally agree with you, and those of you who've read anything I've written about this know that what I feel about this. It is exaggerated, the role that the U.S. played in, for instance, causing these challenges and the crisis. Now, that's not to say that the U.S. wasn't intervening throughout, right? It certainly was. But my view is that the earlier examples, instances of U.S. intervention show not only, of course, that the U.S. is meddling in Chilean affairs and trying to direct the outcomes, but the thing is, those instances are also demonstrating that the U.S. can't always get what it wants. And that's what happens, for instance, when they try to prevent Allende from being inaugurated between September and November of 1970. They're intervening ferociously, right? But they can't direct the affairs of Chile's politics at the time, right? Later, right, U.S. intervention does become more consequential, right? But one of the reasons it becomes consequential is because of what's happening domestically. In other words, the way I look at it is that the conditions of, if you want to call it, the class struggle and class conflict in Chile, right, are kind of what determine how effective U.S. intervention could be at any moment in time, right? So it's not to deny that American intervention is happening throughout, and it's ferocious, as I said, but it's to say that it matters to the extent that it has an opening, which is shaped by domestic Chilean politics. All right, all that was a long kind of preface to your question, which was to kind of sort out, right, these different types of factors. The macroeconomic problems, and I'm gonna speed through this just for reasons of time, and it's also probably the area in which I know the least in some respects. But the macroeconomic challenges that Allende faces are very significant, and one of the main issues is that Chile starts to face a significant trade imbalance and an accounts deficit, right? So to maintain its reforms, its the pace of its reforms, right? To maintain its socialization program, its nationalization program of industry, and investing more and more in national industry, right? It needs hard currency. It needs real revenue, and that starts to dry up. Now, one of the reasons it does start to dry up is because of the blockade that the U.S. is kind of orchestrating globally, that's shutting down opportunities, commercial opportunities for Chile, right? So it no longer has the hard currency to.
And also, copper prices worldwide are
dropping at
which
the
is
same
just
time. So it's this double blow, right? That not only are copper prices falling, the export markets are also more reticent to buy Chilean copper because of U.S. bullying, right? And so that leads to all kinds of problems. One of the things that the Chilean government has to do as it's trying to, work this out, to find other outlets, to find other sources of, for instance, machinery, replacement parts. This became a huge issue at the end, middle of 72 to all the way through 1973, right? Is that it starts to do one of the few things it feels it can do, which is to just print more money. And that's one of the things that produces is this massive spike in inflation, which then not only erodes real wages, but by the end of 72 and throughout 73 reverses the gains in workers' real wages in Chile. So that's a really, really central problem that the UP, Popular Unity Government, La UP, we say in Chile, is facing at the time. So there's that, right? Then there's also, of course, the opposition from the Chilean capitalist class, right, that trickles down to middle layers, and as you said, to some sectors of the working class as well. And that was was best illustrated by the miners' strike late in under Allende's government, right? But as can be expected, essentially, Chile's capitalist class, right, goes on an investment strike. Now, it's interesting because there's a way in which this extortion that's happening, this investment strike, is mitigated by the successful policies of the first 2 years of Allende's government. Despite what ultra left people say about Allende, right? There had been a really aggressive nationalization drive during the first 2 years. So that, as I said, the result was that about half of all industrial property was under public ownership at the time, right? So that kind of mitigates this behavior by capitalist elites, right? But another, as I said, and as you mentioned, right, this opposition starts to trickle down, and one of the things that really hurt Allende, around the middle August of 1972, is a trucker strike and a transportation strike, right? That compounds this macroeconomic problem, right? That is really founded in these commercial trade blockages, right? Because it helps shut down, right, the domestic economy in many ways, right? So these are all challenges that Allende is facing at the time, and he starts to run out of options in many respects, right? And then what's critical, and I know I'm not exactly following the way you parsed it out, but what's critical, right, is that by middle of 1972, not only is the elite opposition intensifying, right, its sabotage, something is happening politically that I think is absolutely crucial for the way Allende reacts, the debates that start to emerge and really intensify, right, within the popular unity, and the final outcome, which is that the right, as we had established, or I should say the elites, right, we had established that they entered 1970 divided, right? By late 1972, they've come back together. They've reunified, right? And so even if popular backing for Allende has been growing, right, throughout this period, largely because of the successes, right, of the first 2 years, right? Even with that extra popular support, and it's become very mobilized, very militant on the street. Allende is now facing, right, a reunified elite, which really made his life impossible, and ultimately, right, decides the unfolding of events. I should say more about the expansion of popular support for Allende during the first 2 years of popular unity government. We said that he won the election with 36% of the vote. By, if I'm not mistaken, the 1972, might be 71, local elections, popular unity slates, the popular unity slate has won 50% of the vote. And by March of 73, when the crisis is already quite deep, quite intense, popular unity wins 44% of the votes in the midterm elections of 1973.
Because it's easy, it's not necessarily easy, but the government can point to sabotage and disruption and external factors, and people can see it themselves unfolding.
That's right. And again, despite the reputation that Allende has acquired in certain sectors as a mild reformist, or whatever you want to call him, there's a way in which he understands that he needs a mobilized base, right? And so throughout that period, popular mobilization and popular organization is actually growing, largely with the support of the state. And so he, again, reaches the March 73 elections, gets 44% of the vote. The problem is that the consolidated, the reunified right, now assembled under this, I think it's called something like the Confederacy for Democracy, or I think something like that, la CODE in Spanish, gets something like 55% of the vote. And at that point, it's clear they're not going to let him succeed. They will call on the military to intervene if he doesn't back down. That is clear by early 1973.
So is there actually a division within the elites as far as strategy to oust Allende? Like, is there, when we think about the Christian Democrats who are getting increasingly militant in their opposition to Allende, are they basically saying, resign and we need the military to restore the constitutional order, which is is that what they're saying? Which is basically the same as the right, who just wants to launch a coup, and maybe, but also again, like, so in other words, what I'm trying to distinguish between is, we saw in Latin America recently the new batch of coups in Honduras, in Bolivia now, are coups that use a veneer of constitutionality to cover what they're doing. Whereas, let's say a coup like the Arbenz government in the 50s in Guatemala, that's just a blatant and very naked coup. Was this more the latter or the former, or were elites pursuing different strategies in the lead up to September 1973?
Yeah, it's hard to disentangle the two. No sector of elites at the time that CODE was formed, right, and essentially blackmail Allende in Congress. They say, look, if you continue to expropriate lands, if you continue to allow workers to pressure you to nationalize industries, you will have breached that agreement, the 1970 agreement, and we will call in the military, right? They're all saying that. Now, and no sector is publicly saying, and by the way, we want the military to come in and stay in power, right? That's not happening. They're all, at least, publicly asserting that Allende has escaped the bounds of constitutionality, and we need the military to intervene and restore constitutional order, right? Now, it could be, and it was, in fact, that different sections had varying medium to longer term visions. Certainly the Christian Democrats felt very confident that once they got rid of Allende, normal democratic and electoral rules would be restored, and they would run and they would reclaim power. Right? There's the first post-dictatorship president, Patricio Aylwin, this Christian Democrat. And he was centrally involved. I think he was the head of the Senate. And he's saying to Allende, you got to do this or we're going to call in the military. Well, in their kind of somewhat naive mind, they felt they can control the situation. And I'm sure the far right wanted nothing more wanted much more than that. They didn't just want the military to intervene and then return power to civilians. They wanted the military to do what it eventually did, which was to crush, almost permanently, stamp out the power and the foundations for power of the working class. But they weren't saying it publicly, and they were quite unified in this one position of military intervention to allegedly restore constitutional order. Now, that difference becomes important because once Pinochet does intervene, once the coup does occur in a day like this, 50 years ago, whatever, September 11th, 1973, Pinochet and the junta, the military regime, have this social backing from that section of elites, which does play an important role in the longevity of the dictatorship and its brutality as well.
So I guess I have to ask you the question of the common takeaway that I learned when I first joined the left, and I was around more Trotskyist and other inclined milieus, was that two lessons that they draw from the Allende experience. Well, of course, being very laudatory about Allende and his own intentions and history and whatnot, is that one, it shows the dead end of the parliamentary road to socialism, and two, it shows Allende should have armed the workers and everything would have turned out fine. The coup could have been resisted, and that's obviously tied in with how his parliamentary strategy is perceived, because he's just too moderate, and he gets caught because of that. What's your counter to both? And I guess instead of just focusing on responding to both those, because I think you'll rightly dismiss some of those criticisms. What is our takeaway as socialists from the Allende years, and what relevance does it have, not necessarily to the left in the U.S., but the left in Latin America, the left elsewhere?
Yeah, of course, I disagree with the kind of standard line that we're all trained in, or that they tried to train us in. As you said, that Allende was too soft, or he was too committed to bourgeois institutions of power. And that, as you said, at that critical moment that we described earlier, right? Rather than hesitate, rather than to make concessions, he should have pushed further. If that meant encouraging more land takeovers, more land occupations, more occupations of industry, do that. After all, that, from that perspective, right, which I don't think should be completely dismissed offhand, right? There's a logic to it. From that perspective, any success that Allende was going to have depended on the mobilized working class and the militancy of the working class and popular sectors. And since these groups were mobilizing, they were increasingly militant, he should have fomented that to meet the assault that was inevitably coming. Right? That's I think one way of cashing it out that makes some sense, right? And in fact, they go on to say that the fact that the coup happened and the massacres followed demonstrate that he chose the wrong path. But what that position or those positions fail to account for. And I should say, that kind of disagreement was playing itself within the Popular Unity government or coalition itself. His own party was calling for that kind of more aggressive push from below and toward the left, right? That's the left wing of the Socialist Party, which had become the dominant wing at the time, favored that strategy, as did the left outside of the Popular Unity government, which was the MIR, the Movimiento Izquierda Revolucionario, the left revolutionary movement, which had real influence at the time. But what those positions fail to take into account, I think, is largely what we described earlier, which was that by 1973, elites had come back together, and they controlled the armed forces, they controlled large parts of the state apparatus, and to encourage further confrontation, and moreover, armed confrontation, which is what they were calling for, was to call for an absolute one-sided bloodbath. And remember what I said at the opening, Allende is kind of the helmsman. He's marshaling this whole process, and he understands what's at stake. What's at stake is not necessarily the immediate achievement of socialism in Chile. After all, it had been 3 years. It's kind of ridiculous, right? I think you can, from a backward starting point in economic and social terms, right, that you could go on to accomplish socialism in even 6 years. Let's say that he has his whole term. It's pretty fantastical, right? And he understands that what's really at stake is not necessarily that. But what's at stake are decades of popular organization. What's at stake, again, decades of a labor movement that's developed over this time, that has matured, that has adopted an independent class position, that has now a labor confederation that was independent of any other classes or elite influence and power, right? And have their eyes set on the goal of socialism. And so his strategy is to say, look, and by the way, this was also the Communist Party strategy, which sided with him in this debate and was considered quite moderate, and was in relative terms, right? Say, look, we've achieved a lot. It's time now to consolidate what we've achieved. If we need to make some concessions, we will, right? To then see what we can accomplish, perhaps more gradually down the line. And the slogan was consolidar para avanzar, so consolidate so that we can advance down the road. And the opposite strategy was saying, no, avanzar para consolidar. No, let's push further now so then we can consolidate socialism, right? But that I think that path, that more radical ultra left path, that's how I would qualify today, was absolutely suicidal, right? And Allende did the only thing he could, which was to really try to buy time, try to hope that some circumstances would change. Again, if it meant prolonging things through a series of concessions, why not? Why not think of Chilean socialism, right, the road to socialism, as a more extended process, right, where you could even lose an election and then come back and vie for power again? Instead, things had become so accelerated, right, and so escalated, right, that the left wing and parts of the class itself, the working class and the peasant class, were saying no, socialism now. And he's trying to contain that and say, listen, that's suicidal. Now, the fact that his strategy failed, again, to take on some of the criticisms, right? For some people, that means, you see, that was the wrong strategy, right? It failed. Look what happened. The coup came anyway. But that doesn't mean it was the wrong strategy. If you're presented with two very tough options, they're both likely to fail, but one has a slightly higher chance of succeeding, buying you time. That's the one you should go for, and I think that's what Allende was doing.
Well, thank you so much, René. That took us right to 7 o'clock, so I think that's a great place to end it. We had some good questions, but we'll probably end it there, and we'll have you again on soon, maybe to talk about your latest Catalyst piece, which everyone should check out. And just as one final reminder, we are on tomorrow with another episodes of Weekends with Ana Casperan and Nando Vila. And our guest is Jane McAlevey, who'll be talking about labor movement strategy and lots of other things. So that's at 1 p.m. Eastern. Please tune in, press like, press subscribe. You get alerts when we're broadcasting. We'll be doing these broadcasts at least 3 times a week, hopefully more with René. And please do check out the latest edition of Catalyst, which has René's piece. To read the latest one, you got to subscribe. We do have like a $20 subscription discount floating around there. It's on the Catalyst Twitter page. If you want to read his very long, like almost book-length piece on the pink tide from the summer, that is currently not behind a paywall, so you should check that out. It's from summer 2018. Is that right? Is it fall?
Yeah,
summer 2018. Yeah. There we go. But thanks a lot, René. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. If I'm going to come back on to discuss the latest piece, let's give people the couple of years they need to get through it.
Yeah, right.
And then the other thing is, I think there are lessons, and we're not going to open this up now, but there are lessons.
No. Keep going.
Even for the U.S. left today, in what happened.
Okay, good. Because I didn't want to end on that, because often, like when we have these historical conversations, it always has to come back to like the fight for Medicare for all in the U.S., which really does matter. I'm not joking about that, but it is like. It's almost like the way The Nation magazine would end everything, which is kind of like we need a Syriza of the U.S., we need a Podemos of the U.S., whereas like I just want to understand Syriza and Podemos on their own terms, so I didn't want to push you in that direction. But if you're willing to go there by yourself, then
I'll be very brief.
Go for it.
No, I'll be very brief, and it doesn't center around actual policies. I think, I just think the main thing is, and Allende was a master at this, is that whatever you're proposing, whatever you're trying to do, right, has to match the actual reality on the ground. And it's really important today. We can call for all kinds of reforms and, backed by all kinds of slogans that sound nice, that are morally, right, the best position. The way, for instance, the Mead was calling for, arming the workers and the peasants and building socialism now. We could do that all we want. But the real thing is to understand what the actual layout of the land is, what the constraints are upon our possibilities, and what our actual capacities are. Now, we don't leave it at that. We build our capacities given the layout of the land, right? But it's especially when your movement and your organizing, your politics are being advanced, right, in the name of workers' rights, in the names of poor people's rights, right? You've got to be really serious, and you got to make sure that whatever it is you're proposing politically, strategically, right, can actually accomplish something given real conditions on the ground. And I think the left in the U.S., it's made huge strides over the last 5 to 10 years, right? But there's such a basic lesson. I think it continues to fail at that quite often, unfortunately.
Right. We don't want noble defeats. We want victories. And Allende was someone who was trying to carve out a strategy to win. He was in government in the 1930s. He was a senator for decades. He was failed 3 times, I guess, 3 times
Yep.
in election bids. He was someone who knew that we on the left need to be marathon runners, not sprinters. And I think we could take that from his legacy. But thanks again, René, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.